What would you do if the only thing keeping your 6-year-old child from freezing to death was a crumbling, forgotten mansion hidden deep in the woods? For Samantha Gallagher, stepping through the rotting doors of the isolated Croft estate wasn't a choice. It was raw, desperate survival. But as the bitter winter storm raged outside, she soon realized this house wasn't just abandoned. It was intentionally erased from the map. Behind its boarded-up windows and dust-choked hallways laid a 30-year-old secret, a hidden fortune, and a terrifying reason why the original owners never returned. Some doors are locked to keep intruders out, but others are heavily sealed to keep a dark past hidden. The biting November wind howled through the towering pines of Oakhaven, Oregon, carrying with it a mixture of freezing rain and despair. Samantha Gallagher pulled the collar of her threadbare wool coat tighter around her neck, her shivering arms securely wrapped around the small, trembling shoulders of her 6-year-old son, Leo. They had been walking for nearly 4 hours since the local shelter had turned them away, at maximum capacity due to the unseasonable, brutal cold front that had slammed into the Pacific Northwest. Samantha's bank account was a flat, unforgiving 0. The eviction from their cramped, mold-infested apartment had happened precisely 3 days ago, courtesy of a landlord who lacked the capacity for empathy. Now, the fading afternoon light was bleeding out of the sky, replaced by a bruised, charcoal-grey darkness that promised snow. Real deadly snow. "Mommy, my feet are numb," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind whipping through the branches. His lips were taking on a terrifying pale blue tint. "I know, baby, I know," Samantha said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Just a little further. We'll find somewhere warm, I promise." It was a promise she had no idea how to keep. They were walking along the narrow, dangerous shoulder of County Route 9, miles away from the town centre. The woods here were dense, a tangled labyrinth of hemlock and thick brambles that locals rarely ventured into. Desperation makes the human eye sharp, and it was only because Samantha was frantically scanning the tree line for any sort of rocky overhang or hunter's blind that she saw it. Barely visible through a thick curtain of dead ivy and overgrown thorn bushes was a wrought iron gate. It didn't look like a farm gate. It was tall, ornate, and severely rusted, featuring a creeping vine motif that was slowly being devoured by actual, living vines. There was no driveway leading up to it anymore, just a faint, unnatural depression in the earth where pavement had once been, long surrendered to the forest. "Leo, look," Samantha breathed, pointing with a frozen, trembling finger. She pushed through the wet, thorny brush, wincing as a briar tore a long scratch across her cheek. The gate was chained, but the padlock had rusted completely through. With a desperate heave, Samantha threw her weight against the iron bars. It protested with a loud metallic shriek that echoed eerily through the quiet woods, giving way just enough for a person to squeeze through. She pulled Leo through the gap. The moment they stepped onto the other side, the atmosphere shifted. The howling wind was instantly muffled by the incredibly dense canopy of ancient trees that formed a natural, oppressive dome over the property. They walked up the ghost of a driveway, the crunch of dead leaves deafening in the sudden stillness. Then, looming out of the freezing fog like a phantom ship, the house appeared. It was a massive, sprawling Victorian-style estate, easily 3 stories high, complete with a wraparound porch and a towering turret. But it was entirely swallowed by nature. Ivy choked the brickwork, crawling up to the 2nd-story windows. The roof sagged in places, missing shingles like broken teeth. But what struck Samantha as the strangest, even in her panic, was that the house didn't look vandalized. Abandoned properties near highways were usually covered in graffiti, stripped of their copper pipes, and littered with broken glass. This place was untouched. It was as if a heavy curtain of camouflage had been pulled over it, hiding it from the eyes of the world for decades. "Is someone there?" Leo asked, clutching her leg. "No, sweetie," I think it's been empty for a very long time, Samantha replied. They hurried onto the rotting wood of the porch. The front door was massive, made of solid oak, but it was dead-bolted. Samantha didn't have the luxury of time to politely look for a key. Leo was shivering violently now, his teeth chattering in a rhythm that terrified her. She moved to the side of the porch, finding a tall, narrow parlor window. Taking off her heavy boot, she wrapped her scarf around her hand and smashed the heel of the boot into the glass near the latch. The glass shattered inward. Samantha reached carefully through the jagged hole, her fingers finding the cold brass lock. She turned it, pushed the window up, and lifted Leo inside before hoisting herself over the sill. They tumbled onto a thick, dusty Persian rug. The air inside was freezing, but it was still. They were out of the wind. They were out of the rain. Samantha pulled Leo into her chest, wrapping him in her coat, rocking him on the floor of the dark, silent house. She had found them shelter, but as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she began to realize that finding the house was only the beginning of their nightmare. The silence in the house was absolute, thick and heavy, like a woolen blanket pressed against the ears. Samantha waited on the floor for 10 minutes, her breathing slowly returning to normal as she rubbed Leo's arms and legs to generate friction and heat. Once his violent shivering subsided into a mild tremble, she stood up, her joints aching from the cold. "Stay right here, Leo. Don't move from this rug," she instructed softly. "It's dark," he whimpered. "I'm just going to find us some blankets. I won't let you out of my sight." Samantha pulled a cheap plastic flashlight from her duffel bag. Its yellow beam cut weakly through the dense darkness, illuminating dancing motes of dust that looked like miniature snowstorms. As she swept the light around the room, a profound sense of unease settled in her gut. They were in a grand living room. Furniture was scattered around the space, but it wasn't covered in sheets like you saw in the movies. A plush, velvet sofa sat facing a massive stone fireplace. A heavy oak coffee table sat between them. On the table rested a ceramic coffee mug, thick with a layer of grey dust, beside a newspaper that was curled and yellowed with age. Samantha approached the table cautiously. She leaned down to look at the newspaper. The date printed at the top was October 14th, 1988. 38 years ago. She backed away, scanning the room. Everything was left exactly as it had been. There was a pair of men's slippers, neatly placed by an armchair. A bookshelf was fully stocked with hardcover novels and encyclopedias. It wasn't just abandoned, it was frozen in time. The occupants hadn't packed up and moved. They had simply vanished in the middle of a mundane autumn morning. "Mum, I'm still cold," Leo's voice brought her snapping back to the present. The mystery of the house didn't matter. Survival mattered. "I'm looking, baby," she called back. She navigated out of the living room and into a grand foyer. A sweeping staircase led to the second floor, the wooden banister coated in a thick layer of grime. She decided against going upstairs just yet. Heat rises, but the roof looked compromised, and she didn't want to risk a structural collapse in the dark. Instead, she pushed through a swinging door that led into a massive retro kitchen. Faded yellow floral wallpaper peeled at the corners. Appliances that belonged in a vintage catalogue sat dormant. She opened drawers frantically. Silverware, dish towels, old matchbooks. Finally, in a pantry off the kitchen, she struck gold. Stacked neatly on a wooden shelf were several thick wool emergency blankets, still sealed in thick plastic wrapping, right next to rows of dust-covered canned goods and gallon jugs of water that had long since evaporated into nothingness. She grabbed 3 blankets and rushed back to the living room. She stripped Leo out of his wet, freezing clothes and bundled him into the dry wool, doing the same for herself. They huddled together on the velvet sofa, their body heat slowly beginning to pool beneath the heavy blankets. As they sat there in the dark, the wind howling against the thick stone walls outside. Samantha's eyes wandered back to the windows. The flashlight beam had caught something strange earlier, and now she couldn't stop looking at it. She slipped out from under the blankets, ignoring Leo's soft protest, and walked over to the large bay windows facing the front porch. The glass was filthy, but that wasn't what blocked the view. Behind the heavy drapes, thick, sturdy wooden planks were nailed across the window frame. She frowned, running a hand over the rough wood. They were nailed securely, the heads of the thick iron nails sunk deep into the wood. But something was incredibly wrong. She looked closer, tracing the edge of the plank where it met the window frame. The wood was on the inside, but the nails... The sharp, pointed ends of the nails were poking inward through the wood, towards her. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through Samantha's veins, colder than the winter air. If the points of the nails were facing inside, that meant whoever had boarded up this house hadn't done it from the inside to protect themselves. They had done it from the outside. Someone hadn't sealed this house to keep the world out. They had sealed it to keep whoever, or whatever, was inside from getting out. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the house didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a held breath. Samantha looked back at the hallway, the beam of her flashlight trembling. She needed to know what kind of tomb she had just broken her son into. Morning broke with a dull, grey indifference. The storm hadn't stopped. It had merely settled into a relentless driving sleet that pelted against the sides of the old house like handfuls of gravel. Samantha awoke with a stiff neck and a deep, gnawing hunger. Beside her, Leo was fast asleep, a small, warm lump beneath the heavy wool blankets. She carefully extracted herself, the cold air immediately biting at her exposed skin. Despite the terrifying realization about the boarded windows the night before, daylight brought a stubborn sense of pragmatism. They were alive. They had shelter. Now, they needed fire and food. Samantha began to explore the ground floor with a sharper, more analytical eye. The kitchen pantry, while mostly filled with expired, bulging cans that were a clear botulism risk, did yield a few treasures. She found a sealed glass jar of dried oats that looked relatively uncorrupted, and, more importantly, a large box of long-stemmed fireplace matches wrapped in a plastic bag to keep out moisture. She returned to the living room and set about building a fire in the massive stone hearth. The chimney flue groaned in protest when she pulled the rusty lever, sending a cascade of soot and dead leaves onto the hearth. She used pages from the 1988 newspaper and broke pieces of a rotting wooden chair she found in the dining room for kindling. When the first flames finally licked upwards, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the dusty room, Samantha let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since yesterday. The heat was a small, victorious comfort. As she sat on her heels, feeding thicker pieces of wood into the growing fire, she noticed a draft. It wasn't coming from the room behind her, but from the fireplace itself, specifically from the stone wall adjacent to the hearth. She leaned closer. One of the large grey stones forming the side of the fireplace mantel looked slightly misaligned. There was a noticeable gap between the mortar and the stone, and a faint cold breeze was steadily blowing through the crack. Curiosity overcoming her exhaustion, Samantha grabbed the iron fire poker. She wedged the flattened end into the gap and applied pressure. The stone didn't budge at first, but with a hard, desperate shove, it ground forward with a gritty, scraping sound. It wasn't a structural stone. It was a heavy, perfectly carved facade. Behind it was a small, dark cavity cut directly into the chimney breast. Samantha reached inside, her hand brushing against cold brick before her fingers closed around something wrapped in thick oilcloth. She pulled it out. It was a heavy, rectangular package, bound tight with a rotting leather strap. She carried it to the sofa, sitting beside the still sleeping Leo. Her fingers fumbled with the brittle leather, snapping it in half. She peeled back the layers of oilcloth, sending a cloud of ancient dust into the air. Inside was a ledger. Not a bank ledger, but a personal journal, bound in dark brown leather. The pages were thick and yellowed. On the inside cover, written in an elegant, sweeping cursive using fountain pen ink, was a name: Jonathan Croft. May 1988. Samantha turned to the first entry. May 12th. They think they've won. They think because they wear the badges and control the banks that they can squeeze the life out of this town. But they don't know what my father left beneath the foundation. They don't know about the vault. Samantha's brow furrowed. She turned a few pages, scanning the erratic, increasingly frantic handwriting. August 4th. The money is secured. Over 2 million. Untraceable. I pulled it right out from under Sullivan's nose. But the paranoia is setting in. I saw headlights at the edge of the tree line tonight. They are looking for it. I have to hide it deeper. I have to seal the basement. October 12th. They know. Sullivan was here today. He didn't ask questions. He made threats. I'm sending Marie and the girls to my sister's in Seattle tomorrow. I will stay behind to finish the seals. If they want the reserve, they will have to tear this house down brick by brick to find it. I am boarding the place up, making it look condemned. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1988, the same date on the newspaper sitting on the coffee table. October 14th, 3 a.m. I made a mistake. They didn't wait. I can hear them in the woods. I've locked the steel door in the basement, but I'm trapped upstairs. If anyone finds this, do not trust the local authorities. Do not trust Sullivan. The money is in the... The sentence ended abruptly, in a chaotic, jagged streak of ink that tore through the paper, as if the writer had been violently pulled away mid-word. Samantha stared at the page, her blood running cold. The story painted a horrifying picture. Jonathan Croft hadn't vanished. He had stolen millions of dollars, hidden it in this very house, and had been cornered by the people he stole it from. And the money was still here. She looked up, her eyes wide, staring at the dust-covered floorboards. $2 million. It was a sum of money that could change her life, erase her debts, and guarantee Leo a future where he never had to sleep in a freezing house again. But as her eyes drifted away from the journal and toward the grand foyer, her heart stopped. There, clearly illuminated by the flickering light of the fireplace, was a footprint in the thick layer of dust on the hardwood floor. It was a large, heavy boot print, and it was completely fresh. Samantha hadn't walked over there. Her boots were small, and she had taken them off by the window. Someone else was in the house. The footprint in the dust wasn't just fresh. It was damp. A tiny bead of melting snow still clung to the deep, grooved tread of the heavy boot mark, catching the faint, flickering orange light of the fireplace. Someone had just walked through the foyer. Someone who had been outside in the freezing sleet mere moments ago. Samantha's breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, icy spike of pure terror driving itself into her chest. The absolute heavy silence of the house suddenly felt entirely different. It wasn't empty. It was occupied, and she and her 6-year-old son were sitting targets illuminated by a crackling fire. She turned her head slowly, painfully, her eyes straining against the dense shadows pooling in the corners of the grand living room. Nothing moved. There was only the rhythmic, howling thud of the winter storm battering the boarded-up windows. With frantic, trembling hands, she shoved Jonathan Croft's leather journal deep into her coat pocket. She scrambled back to the velvet sofa, dropping to her knees. Leo was still asleep, his breathing slow and even beneath the heavy wool blankets. Samantha didn't want to wake him, didn't want to see the panic in his wide, innocent eyes, but she had no choice. "Leo," she whispered, her voice a desperate, harsh rasp. She shook his small shoulder. "Leo, wake up. Right now, baby. Wake up." He stirred, letting out a soft, confused whine. "Mommy, is it morning?" Listen to me very carefully, she breathed, pulling him up and wrapping the thickest blanket securely around his shoulders. We are going to play a game. It's a hiding game. You have to be quieter than a mouse. Do you understand? Not one sound. The urgency in her voice cut through his sleep-addled brain. He nodded mutely, his eyes wide with sudden fear. Samantha grabbed her heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. It was roughly 3 feet long, tipped with a wicked, rusted point. A crude weapon, but it was all she had. She guided Leo away from the firelight, creeping toward the back of the living room, where a heavy, ornate oak door stood ajar. It led to what looked like a formal dining room, heavily shadowed and freezing. Beside a towering glass-fronted china cabinet, Samantha noticed a small, waist-high wooden door built flush into the wall. She pulled the brass ring. It was a dumbwaiter, a relic of the Victorian era used to transport meals from the basement kitchen. The wooden box inside was dusty but sturdy and just large enough for a child. "Climb in," she whispered, lifting him. "Pull your knees to your chest. Do not come out until I open this door and tell you it's safe. No matter what you hear, Leo. Promise me." "I promise, Mommy," he whimpered, tears welling in his eyes. Samantha kissed his cold forehead, her own tears blurring her vision. She closed the small wooden door, plunging him into darkness, and prayed to whatever deity was listening that she hadn't just sealed her son in a tomb. Gripping the iron poker so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, bony white, she crept back into the living room. She pressed her back against the cold, peeling wallpaper near the arched entryway to the foyer. She closed her eyes and listened. For a long moment, there was nothing but the storm. Then, she heard it. Creak. Thud. It was coming from the kitchen. The heavy, deliberate sound of someone moving furniture. Samantha's heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She could run. She could grab Leo, smash another window, and flee back into the freezing woods. But the storm outside was a guaranteed death sentence for a child already bordering on hypothermia. They couldn't leave, which meant she had to fight. She moved with agonizing slowness, placing her feet carefully on the edges of the floorboards where they were least likely to squeak. She crossed the foyer, the damp footprint mocking her as she passed it. She reached the swinging door of the kitchen. A faint, artificial white light was bleeding out from underneath it, a high-powered LED flashlight. Samantha pushed the swinging door open just a fraction of an inch. Standing in the center of the kitchen was a man. He was massive, built like a brick wall, wearing a snow-covered, heavy canvas parka. He looked to be in his late 60s, with a face heavily weathered by time and cruelty, sporting a thick grey beard. In his massive gloved hands, he held a long steel crowbar. He was using it to violently pry up the ancient checkered linoleum tiles near the pantry door, grunting with exertion as the old adhesive cracked and snapped. "Come on, you bastard," the man muttered to himself, his voice a gravelly, deep baritone. 38 years. I know you're down here." Samantha's mind raced. He was looking for the vault. He was one of the people Jonathan Croft had written about. Suddenly, the man stopped. He froze, his head tilting slightly like a hound catching a scent. He slowly lowered the crowbar and sniffed the air. "Wood smoke," he said softly. He spun around with terrifying speed, shining the blinding beam of his flashlight directly at the swinging door. The light caught Samantha's face in the narrow gap. "Well, well," the man growled, reaching beneath his parka and pulling out a heavy, matte black revolver. "Looks like we have a squatter." Samantha kicked the swinging door open, stepping into the room with the fire poker raised defensively. "I just wanted shelter. We're leaving. Just let us go." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He kept the gun leveled squarely at her chest. "Now, why would you be leaving a nice warm fire, little lady, especially in weather like this? Name's Frank Russo, and you are trespassing on private property." "This house is abandoned," Samantha shot back, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to sound fierce. Put the gun down. I have nothing you want. Russo took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning her up and down, lingering on the bulge in her coat pocket. Abandoned. No, forgotten maybe, but not abandoned. I used to work for a man named Bill Sullivan. Ran the biggest private security firm in Portland back in the 80s. We practically owned this county. Until a slippery little accountant named Jonathan Croft decided to skim $2 million off the top of our reserve and bury it. Samantha's blood ran cold. The names from the journal were standing right in front of her, breathing and armed. I don't know what you're talking about, she lied, taking a step back. Don't play stupid, Russo snapped, cocking the hammer of the revolver. The mechanical click echoed sharply in the large kitchen. You built a fire in the living room hearth. The only way you do that and not smoke yourself out is if you open the flue. And if you open the flue, you found the loose stone. Hand over the journal, girl. Samantha hesitated, her grip tightening on the iron poker. I heard a kid crying when I was circling the property looking for a way in, Russo said, his voice dropping to a sinister, chilling whisper. Hand over the journal, or I start shooting holes in the walls until I find him. Defeated, Samantha reached into her pocket and pulled out the leather-bound book. She tossed it onto the dusty kitchen island. Russo grabbed it, his eyes gleaming with a greedy, feverish light. Good girl. Now drop the poker. We have some digging to do. Pick up the crowbar, Russo ordered, gesturing with the barrel of the revolver. Samantha slowly lowered the iron poker to the floor, the metal clattering loudly against the linoleum. She picked up the heavy steel crowbar, its cold weight a poor substitute for the weapon she had just surrendered. Russo had holstered his flashlight, pulling a small miner's headlamp from his pocket and strapping it over a thick wool beanie. The beam illuminated the torn-up section of the floor near the pantry. Croft was a paranoid fool, but he was a master architect, Russo explained, his eyes scanning the pages of the old journal. He writes here that he sealed the basement, made it look like a solid foundation. But there's a seam. Pry up those boards near the baseboard. Samantha knelt, her hands trembling violently. She wedged the crowbar between the thick oak floorboards and pulled. The old wood groaned and splintered. She worked for 20 agonizing minutes under Russo's watchful, armed gaze, tearing away a 3-foot section of flooring. Beneath the wood wasn't dirt or concrete, but a heavy, rusted iron grate with a massive padlock. Step aside, Russo commanded. He stepped forward, raised the revolver, and fired a single shot. The deafening crack of the gunshot in the enclosed kitchen was physically painful. Samantha screamed, covering her ears as plaster dust rained down from the ceiling. The padlock shattered into jagged pieces of shrapnel. Russo kicked the grate open, revealing a dark, square shaft with a rusted iron ladder disappearing into the pitch-black depths. A wave of air washed up from the hole. It was unimaginably cold, smelling strongly of damp earth, mildew, and something else, a faint metallic scent of ancient dried blood. You first, Russo said, gesturing to the ladder. Please, Samantha begged, tears finally spilling over her cold cheeks. Just let me get my son and leave. You have what you want. I don't have a damn thing yet, Russo snarled. The journal says the vault is secured by a dual lock system. I need a pair of hands. Down you go. If you try anything, the kid is next. With no options left, Samantha swung her legs over the edge of the shaft. She gripped the freezing, rusted rungs of the ladder and began to descend. Russo followed closely above her, his boots mere inches from her hands. The descent felt endless. They were going deep beneath the foundation of the house. When Samantha's boots finally hit solid ground, she was standing in ankle-deep freezing water. The basement was massive, a sprawling, cavernous expanse of stone pillars and archways that looked more like a medieval dungeon than a modern cellar. Russo's headlamps swept across the darkness, illuminating stacks of rotting wooden crates, old coal bins, and thick, cobweb-choked pipes. "Keep moving! Toward the back!" he ordered, shoving her shoulder. They waded through the icy water, the sound of their splashing echoing loudly in the subterranean silence. As they reached the far wall, the water level dropped, giving way to a dry, elevated concrete platform. Built into the center of the solid stone wall was a monstrous steel door. It was a bank vault door, complete with a heavy, multi-pronged locking wheel and a digital keypad that had long since rusted into uselessness. "Beautiful," Russo breathed, stepping past Samantha and running his gloved hand over the cold steel. $2 million in bearer bonds and Krugerrand gold. Sullivan spent a fortune tearing up the woods looking for this, and it was right under his boots the whole time. He turned back to the journal, flipping to the final, jaggedly written page, his brow furrowed in anger. Damn it! He didn't finish writing the combination. "Then we can't get in," Samantha said, a desperate spark of hope igniting in her chest. "Let's go." "Shut up," Russo snapped, scanning the wall around the vault. Croft was trapped upstairs. He locked this door from the outside to keep Sullivan away, but he built a manual bypass, a physical keyhole on the inside of the vault's antechamber in case the power failed. Russo moved to the right side of the vault door. He began frantically feeling along the rough stone wall. Suddenly, he grunted in satisfaction, pushing hard against a large stone block. It gave way with a grinding scrape, revealing a narrow, dark ventilation duct, barely 2 feet wide. "It's a bypass chute, leads to the other side of the heavy door," Russo said, a cruel smile spreading across his weathered face. He looked at the narrow hole, then looked down at his own massive, heavily padded frame. "I won't fit." He turned the gun on Samantha. "But you will." "No," Samantha gasped, backing away. The duct was impossibly small, a pitch-black tunnel of solid stone. The thought of crawling into it paralyzed her lungs. "You are going to crawl in there. You are going to drop into the antechamber, find the manual release lever, and open that heavy door from the inside," Russo said, his voice deadly calm. "Or I walk upstairs, find the kid, and end this right now." Samantha closed her eyes, a sob tearing from her throat. She thought of Leo, huddled in the dark dumbwaiter, waiting for her. She had to survive. She took the small LED flashlight Russo offered her and approached the hole. She got on her hands and knees and squeezed her shoulders into the tight stone duct. The air inside was dead and choked with decades of dust. "Go!" Russo barked, slapping the sole of her boot. Samantha crawled. The stone scraped against her coat, catching on the fabric. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, a suffocating, heavy weight pressing down on her chest. The beam of the flashlight bounced erratically against the narrow walls. She crawled for what felt like an eternity, the duct sloping sharply downward until suddenly the floor simply vanished. She tumbled forward, crying out as she fell several feet, landing hard on a cold concrete floor. She gasped for air, the wind knocked out of her. As she scrambled to her knees, she swept the flashlight beam around the new room. She was inside the vault's antechamber. The massive steel wheel of the door was directly in front of her. But as the beam of light swept across the floor, it hit something that made Samantha freeze in absolute horror. Lying propped against the base of the vault door was a skeleton. It was dressed in the rotting, moth-eaten remains of a 1980s business suit. But that wasn't the most horrifying part. The skeleton's right leg, just above the ankle, was caught in the jaws of a massive, rusted steel bear trap. The bone was completely shattered where the jagged iron teeth had clamped shut. Scrawled in dried brown blood on the steel door above the skeleton were 3 words: "Sullivan wins nothing." Jonathan Croft hadn't locked himself upstairs. He had come down here to hide, had accidentally triggered his own brutal perimeter defense in the dark, and had bled to death right in front of his own treasure. And clutched in the bony, skeletal fingers of his right hand was a heavy, ornate brass key. "Hey!" Rousseau's muffled, angry voice echoed through the thick steel of the vault door. He was banging the butt of his revolver against the metal. "Open the damn door, girl, or I swear to God!" Samantha stared at the skeleton, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The horrific reality of Croft's final hours painted a grim picture of pure, unchecked paranoia. He had died entirely alone in the dark, tethered to the ground like an animal, inches away from a fortune that couldn't save his life. She forced herself to move. She crawled forward, squeezing her eyes shut as she reached out. Her fingers brushed against the dry, brittle bone of Croft's hand. She shuddered violently, prying the heavy brass key from the skeletal grip. It was icy cold. She stood up, shining her flashlight onto the massive steel door. Beside the heavy turning wheel was a large, brass keyhole. She inserted the key. It was stiff, protesting with a harsh screech of metal against metal, but with a desperate two-handed twist, she heard a heavy, satisfying thunk echo from deep within the door's mechanisms. Samantha grabbed the large steel wheel and threw her entire body weight into it. It turned with agonizing slowness. Finally, she pulled backward. The massive, foot-thick steel door swung open on perfectly balanced hinges, revealing the flooded, cavernous basement on the other side. Rousseau stood there, the revolver still gripped tightly in his hand. His eyes immediately darted past her, completely ignoring the skeletal remains on the floor. He was looking at the inner vault door, which was now unlocked. "Move," he growled, pushing her roughly aside. He stepped into the antechamber, his boots crunching carelessly over the scattered bones of Jonathan Croft. He grabbed the handle of the secondary steel cage door and yanked it open. Inside the small 10 by 10 vault, the beam of his headlamp reflected off something breathtaking. Stacked on metal shelving units were rows upon rows of tightly banded stacks of cash, $100 bills that looked slightly moldy but entirely usable. But taking up the center of the room was a heavy wooden pallet stacked high with dull yellow bricks. Gold bullion, genuine heavy bars stamped with the seal of the First Mutual Bank of Portland. Rousseau let out a breathy, manic laugh. He holstered his gun, completely overcome by the sight. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees. He grabbed a gold bar, weeping as he pressed the cold metal to his cheek. "I found it. I actually found it." Samantha stood near the open doorway, her mind racing. Rousseau was distracted. This was her chance. But as she took a slow step backward toward the exit, her boot caught on something on the floor. She looked down. Hidden beneath the dust and the skeletal remains of Croft's ruined suit was a thick, braided steel cable. It ran from a pressure plate beneath the gold pallet directly to a massive, rusted winch bolted to the wall beside the heavy vault door. She looked up at the door itself. A heavy iron counterweight hung precariously above the hinges. Croft's final journal entry echoed in her mind. If they want the reserve, they will have to tear this house down. The vault wasn't just hidden. It was a tomb. It was rigged. Rousseau, lost in a fever of greed, grabbed a large canvas duffel bag he had strapped to his back and began frantically throwing stacks of cash and heavy gold bars into it. The moment he lifted the fourth gold bar from the pallet, the pressure plate beneath it shifted upward with a loud, mechanical clack. The sound cut through Rousseau's manic laughter. He froze, the heavy, rusted winch on the wall violently released. The steel cable snapped taut, vibrating with immense tension. The iron counterweight above the door plummeted downward. With a deafening groan that shook the very foundation of the house, the massive, foot-thick steel vault door began to swing shut. "No!" Rousseau screamed, dropping the gold. He lunged toward the doorway, his heavy boots slipping on the dusty floor. Samantha didn't hesitate. She dove through the doorway, rolling hard onto the wet concrete platform of the main basement, just as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind her. The booming impact echoed through the subterranean chamber like a bomb detonating. A massive cloud of dust exploded into the air. Samantha lay on her back in the shallow water, gasping for air, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She stared at the vault door. The heavy locking bolts engaged automatically with a series of loud mechanical thuds driven by the dropped counterweight. From inside the vault, she could hear Rousseau screaming. It was a muffled, frantic sound of pure terror. He was hammering against the foot-thick steel, begging, threatening, and crying. He had exactly what he had spent 38 years hunting for, and he would never ever leave that room to spend it. Samantha pushed herself to her feet, her whole body shaking violently. She looked down near her boots. When she had dove out of the vault, she had inadvertently knocked one of the canvas bags Rousseau had brought with him. It had spilled halfway into the water. She reached down. Inside were 3 thick bundles of $100 bills, bound in tight, rotting rubber bands. It wasn't $2 million. It wasn't the gold. But it was more money than Samantha had ever seen in her entire life. It was a lifeline. She shoved the bundles deep into her heavy coat pockets, ignoring the muffled screams still echoing from the steel tomb. She didn't look back. She waded quickly through the freezing water, found the rusted iron ladder, and climbed with a strength she didn't know she possessed. When she pulled herself up into the kitchen, the fire in the living room had burned down to embers, but the house was completely silent, save for the howling wind outside. She ran into the dining room, her boots slipping on the hard wood. She ripped open the door of the dumbwaiter. Leo was sitting there, his knees pulled to his chest, trembling in the dark. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his dirty face. "Mommy," he whispered. Samantha burst into tears, pulling him out of the wooden box and crushing him tightly to her chest. "I'm here, baby. Mommy's here. The game is over." She held him, the thick wads of cash pressing against her ribs beneath her coat. They were safe. The storm outside was still raging, but for the first time in months, Samantha knew they were going to survive it. They had walked into a forgotten nightmare, but they were walking out with a future. The hours that followed the deafening slam of the vault door were a blur of adrenaline-fueled terror and agonizing anticipation. Samantha pulled the heavy velvet sofa across the living room, barricading the swinging door that led to the kitchen. It was a flimsy defense against a man wielding a gun and a crowbar. But logic had fully given way to sheer primal instinct. She huddled with Leo in the corner of the room, clutching the iron fire poker until her hands cramped and locked. For the first hour, the muffled, distant sounds of Frank Rousseau's frantic hammering echoed up through the floorboards. It was a hollow, rhythmic thudding that vibrated against the soles of Samantha's boots. Sometimes, the hammering was accompanied by faint, distorted shouts, curses, threats, and eventually, desperate pleas that dissolved into unintelligible sobbing. And then, just past 3 a.m, the hammering stopped. The silence that replaced it was infinitely worse. It was heavy and absolute, confirming what Samantha already knew about the construction of a bank vault. They were designed to be airtight to protect paper currency from fire and flood. A man of Rousseau's size, panicking and hyperventilating in a 10 by 10 steel box, would consume the available oxygen in a matter of hours. The horrific realization that she had just entombed a human being washed over her, bringing a wave of nausea. She had killed a man. It was in self-defense. It was to save her son. But the moral weight of it pressed down on her chest like a physical stone. "Mommy, why is it so quiet now?" Leo asked, his voice a tiny, fragile thread in the dark. "The bad man is gone, sweetie," Samantha whispered, kissing the top of his head, her lips tasting salt and dust. "He went away. We just have to wait for the sun." When the grey light of dawn finally began to bleed through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, the storm had broken. The relentless howling wind was gone, replaced by the startling brightness of a clear winter morning. Samantha carefully moved the sofa. She crept into the kitchen, her eyes immediately darting to the torn-up floorboards and the gaping black square of the basement shaft. Nothing moved. There was no sound. She packed their meager belongings into her duffel bag, transferring the 3 heavy bundles of cash to the bottom, wrapping them securely in one of the wool blankets. She dressed Leo in his dried, slightly stiff clothes, bundled him in her own coat, and carried him out through the shattered parlour window. The world outside had been transformed. Oakhaven's dense forest was buried under a foot of pristine, glittering snow. The rusted gate and the forgotten Victorian mansion looked deceptively peaceful in the morning light. Samantha didn't look back. She trudged through the deep snow, her legs burning with exhaustion, carrying Leo until they finally breached the tree line and hit the ploughed shoulder of County Route 9. They walked for 2 miles before a massive Peterbilt logging truck, kicking up clouds of white powder, hissed its air brakes and pulled over. The driver, a burly, kind-faced man, wearing a flannel jacket with a patch that read, Wayne, leaned out the window. "You folks look half frozen. Climb in," Wayne called out. The blast of the truck's heater was nothing short of miraculous. Wayne didn't ask probing questions about why a woman and a child were wandering the woods after a historic blizzard. He simply handed them a thermos of lukewarm black coffee and drove them 20 miles into the nearest operational town. Samantha asked to be dropped off at a cheap roadside motel on the outskirts of Eugene. She paid for 3 nights in advance using the last crumpled $20 bill in her wallet. The moment the deadbolt clicked shut behind them in room 114, Samantha locked herself in the bathroom, turned the shower on as hot as it would go, and collapsed onto the cheap linoleum floor, sobbing uncontrollably until there were no tears left. Later that evening, after Leo had eaten a hot meal from the diner next door and fallen asleep watching cartoons, Samantha unzipped the duffel bag. She pulled out the bundles of cash and spread them across the other double bed. The money smelled intensely of mildew and ancient dust. She carefully removed the rotting rubber bands, which snapped and crumbled upon contact. She began to count. The bills were all series 1981 and 1985 $100 notes. They were slightly stiff, uncirculated, and entirely consecutive in their serial numbers. 10,000, 20,000, 35,000. When she finished, there was exactly $42,000 sitting on the ugly floral bedspread. It was a fortune. It was enough to secure a lease, buy a reliable used car, and keep them fed for 2 years if she was careful. But as she stared at the faces of Benjamin Franklin lining the bed, a new chilling paranoia began to take root. This wasn't just found money. This was the stolen reserve of a 1980s organized crime syndicate. If she walked into a bank to deposit it, or if she started spending consecutive, uncirculated 1985 hundreds around town, someone would notice. The banking system had evolved. Red flags would trigger. She had escaped the physical tomb, but she was now shackled to a dead man's stolen legacy. To survive, she would have to become a ghost. 6 months later, the freezing nightmare of the Croft estate felt like a lifetime away. Samantha had relocated them to Bend, Oregon, a rapidly growing city where strangers arriving with cash to start over didn't warrant a second glance. She had rented a small, cozy duplex on the edge of town, paying 6 months' rent up front under the guise of an inheritance. She had purchased a reliable 5-year-old Honda Civic from a private seller on Craigslist. Leo was enrolled in a local elementary school, his cheeks rosy with health, the trauma of that night slowly fading from his young mind. Samantha was meticulously careful. She never deposited the old bills into a bank account. She used them exclusively for groceries, gas, and small cash purchases, making sure to break the hundreds at different, busy big-box stores to avoid arousing suspicion from local cashiers. She secured a modest, part-time job as a receptionist at a dental clinic, creating a perfectly legal, taxable income to serve as her cover. On the surface, life was stable. But beneath the facade, Samantha was a prisoner of her own anxiety. She spent her nights at the Deschutes Public Library, scouring microfiche archives and old newspaper clippings, trying to understand exactly whose money she was spending. She learned that Bill Sullivan, the man Frank Russo had worked for, hadn't just been a local thug. He ran Sullivan Security Solutions, a front for a massive multi-state racketeering and extortion ring that had eventually been dismantled by a joint FBI task force in the mid-1990s. Sullivan had died in federal prison. But the articles mentioned something else, something that made Samantha's blood run cold. The $2 million Jonathan Croft had stolen wasn't extorted mob money. It was part of a Federal Reserve transport that Sullivan's crew had hijacked in 1987. The cash and the gold bullion were government property. Croft, the syndicate's chief accountant, had grown a conscience, or a severe case of panic, and had stolen the shipment back, intending to use it as leverage to buy federal immunity. He had disappeared before he could make the deal. Samantha was spending stolen government funds. Every $100 bill she handed to a cashier was a tiny beacon, a serial number that belonged to the largest unsolved heist in Oregon history. Her meticulous system worked flawlessly for 6 months. Until a Tuesday afternoon in early May. Samantha had just picked Leo up from school and was unlocking the front door of their duplex when a dark blue, unmarked sedan pulled into her driveway. She froze, her hand instinctively gripping Leo's shoulder. A woman stepped out of the vehicle. She was in her late 40s, dressed in a sharp, tailored grey pantsuit. Her blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun. She carried a leather briefcase and an air of absolute authority. She didn't look like a police officer, but she carried the unmistakable posture of someone who could ruin your life with a signature. "Samantha Gallagher?" the woman asked, approaching the porch. Her tone was polite, but her eyes were remarkably cold, scanning Samantha with forensic precision. "Yes? Can I help you?" Samantha asked, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "My name is Evelyn Croft. I believe you and I need to have a very private conversation," the woman said. The name hit Samantha like a physical blow. Croft, Jonathan Croft's daughter. The girl mentioned in the journal who had been sent to Seattle before the nightmare unfolded. I don't know anyone by that name," Samantha stammered, pushing Leo gently behind her. Evelyn stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside were 3 crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. Series 1985. These bills were deposited by a local Safeway, a Chevron station, and a Target, all within a 10-mile radius of this neighborhood over the last 3 weeks. Evelyn stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "I work as a senior forensic accountant for a private asset recovery firm contracted by the Department of Justice. For 38 years, these serial numbers have been dormant, and suddenly they are buying groceries in Bend, Oregon." Samantha felt the blood drain from her face. The world tilted slightly. "You see, Ms. Gallagher, I wrote an algorithm a decade ago specifically to flag these exact serial numbers the moment they hit a federal counting machine," Evelyn continued, stepping onto the porch. "It took some digging through retail surveillance footage to match the transactions to your license plate. But here we are. I know you have the money. And considering my father died protecting it, I suggest you invite me inside before I make a phone call to the FBI field office in Portland." Samantha looked at the quiet suburban street, then down at Leo, who was staring up at her with wide, confused eyes. The game was up. The ghost had been caught. "Go to your room and play with your Legos, Leo," Samantha said softly, her voice trembling. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Come in, Miss Croft." Evelyn Croft did not sit down. She stood in the center of Samantha's modest living room, her eyes darting around the space, taking in the cheap furniture and the scattered children's toys. "Where is it?" Evelyn demanded, turning her sharp gaze back to Samantha. "Where is the rest of the $2 million? "I don't have it," Samantha said, her voice dropping to an exhausted whisper. She walked over to the hallway closet, pulled out a shoebox from the top shelf, and set it on the coffee table. She removed the lid revealing the remaining stacks of cash, roughly $25,000. "This is all I took. I swear to you." Evelyn stared at the shoebox, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "This is a fraction of a single bundle. Where is the reserve? Where is the gold?" "It's still there," Samantha replied, tears finally welling in her eyes. "In the house, in Oakhaven." Evelyn's stoic demeanor cracked. She took a step forward, her voice shaking. "You found the house. You found my father." Over the next hour, the dam broke. Samantha poured out the entire story, leaving nothing out. She told Evelyn about the freezing storm, breaking into the estate, finding the journal, the terrifying arrival of Frank Russo, and the descent into the hidden basement. When she described the skeletal remains caught in the rusted bear trap, Evelyn covered her mouth, sinking slowly onto the sofa, tears streaming down her face. "He was trying to protect us," Evelyn whispered, staring blankly at the floor. "Sullivan threatened to kill me and my mother. My father stole the reserve to trade for federal protection, but he didn't trust anyone. He built that vault as a fortress, and it became his tomb." "I had to lock him in," Samantha sobbed, recalling Russo's muffled screams. "He was going to kill us. He triggered the trap. I just grabbed what I could and ran to save my son." Evelyn sat in silence for a long time, processing the massive, horrific truth. Finally, she looked up at Samantha. The cold forensic accountant had vanished, replaced by a woman who had finally found the closure she had sought her entire adult life. "Frank Russo was a monster," Evelyn said firmly, wiping her eyes. "He was Sullivan's enforcer. If he had gotten out of that vault, you and your son would be buried in those woods. You did what you had to do." "Are you going to turn me in?" Samantha asked, her voice tight with fear. Evelyn looked at the shoebox of money, then back at Samantha. "Miss Gallagher, I don't care about the money. I never did. I care about bringing my father's remains home, and I care about clearing his name. But we have a problem. You are in possession of stolen federal property. If the DOJ finds out you took this, they will prosecute you, regardless of the circumstances." Samantha's heart sank. "Then what do we do?" "We change the narrative," Evelyn said, her eyes narrowing as the brilliant accountant within her took over. "You didn't steal this money. You found it. And as a law-abiding citizen, you are going to report it to the proper authorities." 3 days later, a massive convoy of black SUVs and heavy excavation equipment descended upon the forgotten Croft estate in Oakhaven. Samantha sat in the back of an armoured vehicle alongside Evelyn Croft and Special Agent Thomas Miller of the FBI's Portland Field Office. The operation was massive. It took a team of federal engineers 4 hours to safely cut through the foot-thick steel of the tripped vault door. When they finally breached the room, they found exactly what Samantha had described. The gold bullion sat untouched on the wooden pallet. The stacks of cash lined the shelves, and slumped against the far wall of the vault, perfectly preserved in the dry, airtight environment, was the body of Frank Russo. He had died exactly as Samantha suspected, alone, trapped by the weight of his own monumental greed. In the antechamber, Evelyn was allowed to stand by as forensics gently recovered the skeletal remains of her father, finally freeing him from the rusted iron trap that had held him for 38 years. Because Samantha had voluntarily surrendered the exact coordinates of the missing Federal Reserve transport and directly facilitated the recovery of over $2 million in government assets, not to mention the location of a wanted, presumed dead syndicate enforcer, the FBI offered a deal. The $25,000 Samantha had kept was officially logged as evidence. She was not charged with a crime. Evelyn Croft, utilizing her extensive legal connections within the DOJ, ensured that Samantha was completely shielded from prosecution under the condition of a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding the operation. But the true twist, the one that Evelyn had orchestrated, came 6 months after the investigation concluded. Under the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery and Enforcement Act, private citizens who provide original information leading to the recovery of stolen federal assets are entitled to a whistleblower reward. Because Samantha's information led to the recovery of exactly $2.4 million in gold and currency, her legal claim was processed and approved by the Department of Justice. On a bright, crisp morning in late November, exactly 1 year to the day she had broken into the freezing, forgotten mansion, Samantha checked her mail at her new permanent home. It wasn't a rented duplex. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom house with a sprawling backyard, entirely paid for. She opened an envelope bearing the seal of the United States Treasury. Inside was a cashier's check made out to Samantha Gallagher in the amount of $480,000. Her 20% finder's fee, legally taxed, washed, and entirely hers. She walked into the living room, where Leo was sitting by a roaring, safe and modern fireplace, playing a video game. She looked at the fire, remembering the suffocating darkness of the estate, the smell of damp earth, and the terrifying weight of the steel door. They had walked into a tomb born of greed and paranoia, but they had survived the darkness. Samantha folded the check, placed it in her pocket, and sat down next to her son. The storm was finally over. What a massive, unbelievable journey. From fighting for survival in a freezing, abandoned mansion to uncovering a multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy, Samantha's story proves that sometimes the darkest secrets hold the keys to our salvation. Do you think Samantha made the right call leaving Frank Russo in the vault? Or should she have tried to save him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this real-life thriller kept you hooked until the very end, please smash that like button, share this video with anyone who loves true crime and hidden mysteries, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more incredible, true stories coming your way. Until next time, stay safe out there.